Welcome, everybody. In this episode, we have the one, the only Dr. Jessica Barker, MBE, joining us. So great to have you, Jessica.
It's such a pleasure to be here. What a nice introduction. Thank you.
I happen to have a copy of your book in my hand that Dr. Barker signed for me last year at RSA. I am so happy to finally be able to talk to you a little bit more about this time. Dr. Barker, you can just talk a little bit about yourself to the audience for those who don't know who you are and what brought you on this path to creating this book, and for that matter, the books that you've written that came before this.
Sure. So I have worked in cybersecurity for about 14 years now, always on the human side of cybersecurity. So I've kind of made it my mission over the last 14 years to shine a light on cybersecurity awareness, behavior, and culture. And that's meant working with organizations all around the world on their awareness and culture programs when it comes to cybersecurity. Lots of awareness raising sessions in person, online, creating lots of content, and then also writing some books. And really, with the books, I see them as a way of hopefully reaching a different audience, a wider audience with cybersecurity messages, but also supporting people working in cybersecurity who are looking for resources to support and help them with the programs that they're working on, the communications that they're crafting, the awareness messages that they themselves are trying to share.
And you've certainly succeeded in connecting with a larger audience, a wider audience, as you have. Maybe you could also tell the audience a little bit about you receiving the MBE last year, what that means typically for our American audience who might be a little bit less familiar with that.
Yeah, and this still feels very surreal that this was an experience and an honor I received. So the MBE is part of the Royal Honours system in the UK, and it meant that I was awarded the MBE Medal for Services to Cybersecurity by Prince William on behalf of his father, King Charles. So a very regal day at Windsor Castle where Prince William pinned the medal on me still feels like a dream. And to have my work in cybersecurity recognized in this way is something that I will never forget, and something that I also see as recognition of the increasing importance and value that people understand around the human side of cybersecurity, that this is not an add-on to the rest of the field, but that cybersecurity awareness, behavior, and culture is really integral to this field. It is so important, and it felt really gratifying to have that recognition, not just for me, but for everybody who is working on cybersecurity awareness, behavior, and culture.
And you have been a world-class educator on those topics. You have a really special way of connecting with audiences with the right messages delivered in the right way. I'd recommend anybody to go to Jessica's LinkedIn profile and check out all of her content there. We've used some of Jessica's content ourselves for different videos. It's very effective. It's short, it's engaging, it's great, and it covers even the most recent stuff, including AI, that we'll probably cover here a bit together. So Dr. Barker, who was this written for, and why did you write the book in this way with so much storytelling, also layered in with so much great data and recent media coverage of various breaches and whatnot?
So to answer that question, I'll first take a step back, if I may, and just briefly talk about my first book, Confident Cybersecurity, which I wrote, and it was published in 2020, the first edition. And there I was thinking about myself. I was thinking about myself 10 years previous, entering the cybersecurity field with no background in cybersecurity or really in IT and technology. And so I wrote Confident Cybersecurity for people like me at that point, people who were considering a career in cybersecurity, people who are new to the industry. I really thought about myself back in 2010, 2011, entering the field and on such a learning curve, and how much I would have appreciated a resource that really covered the whole field as much as possible, the human, the technical, and the physical. And then when it came to Hacked, I wanted to write something that was more an extension of my awareness raising. So, thinking about the sessions, particularly that I deliver for organizations, and the way that I like to communicate about the threats, and particularly how people can stay safe, that's what I wanted to do with Hacked. And so, as part of that, storytelling was really integral. It's a huge part of how I communicate awareness raising messages because I love data, statistics. Data is very important. But at the same time, it's stories that people often will remember and that they will share. And this is something that's really wired into us as human beings. We have always used storytelling as a way of communicating messages, sharing lessons, and really kind of performing collective learning. So, when it came to Hacked, I wanted to write a different chapter about different threats and to be very much rooted in storytelling because there are so many fascinating stories in cybersecurity that I think often resonate with people, that help people realize the importance of cybersecurity, that help people realize the threats are real, but that there are things that they can do to better protect themselves. So that's what I led with when I was writing the book, and I hope that people will be able to use it in that way where they can draw on the stories and repeat them, whether that's in the workplace or with family members, friends, neighbors, people in the community.
And getting into those stories a little bit, even starting with the preface, where there's a story about someone's very young experience with a scam and how they took that with them years later. Maybe tell a little bit about that and why you decided to lead off with that story.
So that was, it kind of reflects a fortunate position that I'm in as well, where people come to me with their stories and they will share vulnerable moments in their lives or learning points in their lives. So somebody had got in touch with me and told me about how they had experienced a scam decades before in the real world, in the physical world. And they had told their father about this, and their father had responded with empathy. And this had led to the individual remembering the lesson from that scam, remembering how the con artist had manipulated them. And then being able to use that learning for the rest, for decades and decades when it came to advances in technology. And so for me, it spoke to how we can take a learning point and apply it to different mediums. So, social engineering in the real world, the same tactics are used, whether it is over email, whether it's over the phone, whether it is AI. So it really spoke to me in terms of that, but also the fact that empathy was so important in that experience, that the individual hadn't been shut down, they hadn't been told they were stupid, but that they had been received with empathy, and it made that learning point more, it made it stick more. So these were themes that have been so important in my work. And so when this individual shared that story with me, I just felt like it was a great way of encapsulating some of the messages I wanted to make. And I'm so grateful they agreed to allow me to include that as the opener for the book.
Well, I'm glad that I got it right because that was kind of how I interpreted the subtext of why that story was the one that kicked it off. Because I have recently had an experience like that myself, where there was some kind of an incident that I had to go to my security team with about, and the way that we worked together on it so collaboratively, there was empathy, there was a sense of it wasn't your fault. This can happen. These people are out there doing this kind of stuff, and we got to the root cause of the problem and fixed it immediately before there was any damage. And that was a
Mhm.
purely a result of having a good relationship and a good psychological safety built around this process of coming to your security team with an issue. And that's what I got from your preface, is that it's so important to have just that kind of environment, that kind of culture inside of your organization, whatever it may be.
Oh, well, I'm so glad that that message resonated as well. And that's a great example from you. It really shows that having that empathy, having the relationships built in, it can make such a difference when it comes to responding to an incident or a near miss.
And so with your next stories, because I love stories, what were some of the standout stories that you thought, continuing on from there, what were the ones that really you kind of look back on and you might tell at a cocktail party? Someone asks you for a good cybersecurity story.
Yeah, one that I think is incredibly powerful, and I won't ever forget the first time I heard this individual story, is Sandra Estock's story of how she came to work in cybersecurity. And it came from her actually being a victim of identity theft and identity fraud. And I don't want to kind of take the punchline out, but she had her identity stolen and she discovered this in an incredibly shocking way and had a very shocking experience as a result of her identity being stolen and used. And then she has gone on to build a fantastic career raising awareness of cybersecurity, helping other people be aware of the threats and how to stay safe. And so her story is incredibly memorable. And, it's in the book. It's also in a great TED talk that she gave, which people can watch online, and lots of communications from her talking about her experience and cybersecurity. And that I think is something that is unforgettable, the experience that she went through, but also the fact that she used this for good and she used this to help other people be aware of the threats and be safer online, I think is so inspiring and empowering. So that's a story that is very memorable for me and people will often reflect on and talk to me about. Another story is we briefly mentioned AI before and the rise in virtual kidnapping, in fake kidnappings, people receiving a phone call saying, I've kidnapped your loved one, and then the voice of the loved one is on the line sounding distressed. And that some stories around that are in the book. And this for me is something that seems to be increasingly happening when I do an awareness raising session. Say in an organization, there is usually one or two people in the audience who have either directly received one of these calls or somebody in their close family has. So this is something that is increasing and yet is not spoken about so much, is not particularly well known. So that's a story that I think is really important because it's a growing threat and one that I just think is so upsetting to imagine receiving a call like that, hearing your loved one's voice in distress and going through that whole experience of being so concerned about your loved one and then finding out it's a scam, but still having that impact and that trauma where you have heard somebody you love, you have heard their voice. It's an AI clone, but it sounds just like them. And to hear the distress in their voice and think that they are in such a situation is just horrific.
It is horrific. And it's incredible how seemingly simple it's become to create what just 5 years ago would have been a quite sophisticated form of attack. And what's going on there? How does an attacker get the voice of a loved one? And how do they clone it? How much actual material needs to be out there for them to execute a successful attack like that?
Unfortunately, it's a very small amount of data that attackers need. As you say, the technology around deepfakes has grown and improved and scaled up immensely. And so even just a few years ago, being able to clone a voice or a video was something that took a lot of data and a lot of time and a lot of computing power. Whereas now, to clone a voice, it's a few seconds of somebody's voice to be able to make a clone using, click-through technology. We're not talking about technology that somebody has to sit at home and make. There are websites out there which people can use, drop an audio file of a few seconds of somebody's voice in and make a pretty realistic clone. And this is something, we've done ourselves in awareness raising, made deepfakes of ourselves, and also where clients want it and they give permission, made deepfakes of clients to be able to use in awareness raising. And we've been able to make very realistic, very convincing deepfake clones, both audio and video, using a few seconds of voice and one still image in a photograph, and be able to make clones that convince people in the organization they're seeing the real individual and it's actually a deep fake. And this technology only emerged in 2017, but it has, scaled up and become much more accessible and much more effective in a very short space of time.
What are they typically trying to get out of that sort of an attack?
Money.
Yeah.
Um, and I think to just reflect on this as well, I think one of the biggest myths in cybersecurity is that people thinking, well, I would never be targeted. With attacks like this, they're not so specifically targeted. Email phishing, even this, voice kidnapping, which seems obviously to the victim so personal, but attackers are just playing a numbers game. So they won't be specifically sitting and saying, hey, Jessica Barker, I'm going to target her. They will have, a whole set of targets, of victims that they will pursue, playing a numbers game. And what they ultimately are always really trying to get, particularly in personal attacks, is money. That may be through stealing data to begin with. But in the virtual kidnapping example, it's money. And the cases I'm aware of, I find it very interesting that these generally are combining cutting edge technology with deepfake technology and physical space. So often they are doing these attacks, making these calls and saying, we have kidnapped your loved one, you need to pay a sum of money, and they will ask for that money often in cash, and have somebody, have it arranged that somebody will pick this up in person. So there was a spate of these attacks in Canada, and then somebody as part of this criminal gang was apprehended at an airport with bags of cash. So I find that a very interesting mix, and I assume the criminals are doing that because it's less of a trail. So in the case that I spoke about in detail or wrote about in detail in Hacked, this was a mother who received a call. She was taking one child to a dance class, I think, and her husband, the father of the children, was away with another of their daughters. The mother received a call at the dance class saying, we've kidnapped your daughter, the one who was away. And then she heard her daughter's voice in distress, saying, they've got me. And then the fake kidnapper was saying, you need to pay a large sum of money. The mother's on the phone trying to work out what to do, how to pay the money, trying to negotiate because it was a huge sum. Luckily, because she was at a dance class, she was with other people who were not in that incredibly stressed and emotional state. They were able to clearly, try and contact the father. They were able to contact the police. They were able to track down the daughter, was not kidnapped, but was safe and well. But otherwise, in that case, the mother was being pressured to get a sum of money and hand it over in person. And that seems to be a theme.
Yeah, wow. So our digital world is truly bleeding into our physical world more and more with this. And
Yeah.
especially when you think about that, where it's just a very tiny amount of information on the web that someone could then leverage. What about with organizations now? And there's more and more reports I have heard about people going onto a Zoom chat and all of a sudden they're instructed to do something that would compromise their credentials or compromise their system. Is that something that you've been hearing more and more about? And is that something that you saw kind of happening when you first started writing Hacked which was, sort of at the dawn of ChatGPT being released in the world. So you, by the way, had great timing with writing Hacked as well and releasing it when you did.
Yeah, and now that the book has been out for a year or so, there's been huge advances in AI since the book was released. But I really felt since kind of 2020-ish that, we could already see at that point the advances being made in deepfake technology. There was still a long way to go. We could see that AI was making great strides in advances. So from about 2020, I really felt like, okay, there is going to be this big troubling crossover between AI and between deepfakes and social engineering. And that has been the way that it has moved and will continue to move. For now, I still see, most cases of social engineering being carried out by email and then, by phone, by text message, by WhatsApp. But there is this increase in using AI and deepfake. Absolutely. I'm sure everyone will be familiar with the case that made global headlines, the Hong Kong company, or it was a part of a company that was in Hong Kong. A worker in Hong Kong received a Teams meeting invitation, joined the meeting, and then only afterwards discovered they were the only real person on that Teams call. Everybody else was a deep fake, including the CFO, who, as part of that call, manipulated them into transferring, I think it was about equivalent of $20 million. So it was a huge sum of money. And this was the first case that really made global headlines, where deepfakes were being used live in video conferencing calls, and somebody was socially engineered to transfer such a sum of money because they thought they were communicating with the chief financial officer of their company. And in fact, it was a deepfake clone. And so this is something that organizations need to be increasingly aware of. And it's stories like this that help the people we're communicating with realize that this isn't sci-fi anymore, that this isn't something that is, a far-fetched threat. That yes, they are still the edge cases, but this is something that is happening. It is something that criminals are capable of. And as time moves forward quickly, this will become even more accessible to criminal gangs who will use this more and more in their social engineering and in their cyber attacks.
In your book, it's not all just about the actual problems. You have solutions too. You have recommendations. So as these things are advancing, what are some of the things you tell your clients? What are some things you tell to your audiences to give them hope and to give them some kind of guidance for how they can stay safe and how they can keep their fellow coworkers safe and their family members safe?
I'm so glad you recognized that and highlighted it, Elliot, because this is so important to me. I made it a kind of a rule for myself some time ago that when I raise awareness of a threat, it's so important to really amplify how people can protect themselves from that threat. Otherwise, we're just scaring people. And we know from decades of research in the psychology of fear that if we simply scare people, it doesn't change their behavior in a positive way. It actually is more likely to backfire on us, and they're more likely to switch off or bury their head in the sand or think that we're overblowing the threat. So for every threat I cover in Hacked and in my awareness raising, but for every threat that I cover, every chapter of Hacked ends with takeaways, with what people can do to protect themselves. So having that empowering message is extremely important to me. And when it comes to social engineering, I always communicate that no matter the medium, whether it's email, whether it's the phone, whether it's text, or whether it's AI and deep fake, what we need to look out for is really how we feel. So gone are the days where we tell people to, check emails for spelling or grammatical errors, where we tell people to hover over the link or look at the sender's address. That for me has always not been good enough and potentially lulled people into a false sense of security. But particularly when we're talking about ChatGPT, crafting emails in any kind of language you want, or deepfake technology, we must advance and we must communicate more strategic advice. So for me, that's telling people to look out for communications that are unexpected, that make them feel something, because that's when we're most vulnerable. If we're scared, if we're hurried, if we're panicked, if we're flattered, and then that ask us to do something, whether that's click a link, download an attachment, share personal information, or share money. But the root of that for me, the core of that, is paying attention to how communications make us feel. Because social engineering, when it works, is all about manipulating our emotions, putting us into a state where our judgment is clouded and forcing us to act before we really have time to think. So if you have a communication like that, it's then slow down and verify with the supposed sender via another means. Hey, did you really ask me to do this? Make this money transfer or download this document? I wasn't expecting it from you, and it doesn't seem like the usual way that you might communicate.
Isn't that amazing that with all of our technology out there and all the advances in these attacks, all these advances in our technical protections, that your gut instinct, your feeling, your basic response just instinctually to something can actually be the thing that will be the difference between something bad happening or being safe from that.
Absolutely. And in the age of artificial intelligence, it's our human intelligence, it's our emotional intelligence that becomes so much more important when we are defending ourselves against social engineering. So, really, our critical thinking skills as human beings have never been more important for staying safe online.
And I think that many people in our audience will be receiving your book, many others will be going out and buying it. And I think that what they're going to see is that there is this really interesting way of communicating these different topics, these different types of attacks through the blend of story and statistics. What are some communication principles that you would want to pass on to other people? And many of our audience are security awareness leaders, and they're really tasked with communicating with a user base. But they're also higher level, the CISOs, and even some higher level executives I've talked to who have told me how fascinated they are just about communications and how much they struggle with communicating. And you are an expert communicator. So I'm sort of making a long, convoluted question out of this, but as an author of this book, how would you instruct other people to use your book as a communication tool? And how would you tell them to look for lessons in communication from your book?
For me, when I'm communicating with an audience, one thing is listening. And I think that's something that we can overlook when we're trying to communicate. And so many of us work in cybersecurity because we're passionate about helping people stay safe. And we have this knowledge that we want to share. So sometimes we can overlook the importance of listening and really active listening. So if you have a group of people, a user base that is not changing their behaviors and you're frustrated with that, firstly understanding why is so powerful. And really the best way of doing that is with conversations by asking people in a non-judgmental way. So that's my first thought when it comes to communication is listening and also taking in um, lessons and learning points of when you communicate something, what does resonate. So that's been really important to me over the years. And I've been fortunate to deliver awareness raising to, I mean, that I've counted like over 90,000 people in person, but really the number is way beyond that. So I'm in a very fortunate position where I get lots of data points of what resonates with people and where a message maybe doesn't land. So I take those learning points and I was able to apply them, for example, in writing Hacked. The other important thing for me in communication is really putting myself in the shoes of the audience or the reader and really using empathy to think about how a message is going to land with them and what's going to stick with them and how am I going to support them in maybe understanding a threat but not being so scared by it that they're put off and also not being overwhelmed. In cybersecurity messaging, I think one of the most important things is not what we share, but actually what we don't share, because we can overwhelm people with lists of things to do. So, how can we distill that? How can we make our advice actionable and digestible? And that's why I focus on, you mentioned some of my content earlier, particularly when it comes to videos, short, sharp, bite-sized videos. So people aren't overwhelmed with 100 things to do. They can focus on one thing at a time.
That's such a great point because cybersecurity just by itself, I mean, you and I both we weren't born into this kind of cybersecurity role. We kind of came to it. I think the first time we ever heard the word cybersecurity, we said, cyber what? You know, it just
Yeah.
seems there's so much. And I
Mhm.
think that you can overwhelm someone, even in one little niche of this, when you're talking to users about different forms of attack and how to stay safe, or different forms of attack and why they're dangerous. It can be utterly overwhelming if you try to put it all out there in one single communication. So I think that's an absolutely critical message to people who are trying to communicate to their audiences.
And we can fall foul of the curse of knowledge. So for me, trying to go back to that point where I was that person that Googled, like first heard of cybersecurity, what is cybersecurity? Trying to put myself back into those shoes. And the longer you're in the industry, the harder it is. But remembering what it can be like and the fact that we have this knowledge, but if you work in this industry, there's quite a gap between what you know and maybe the people you're communicating with. So understanding what they do know, so you're not patronizing them, but recognizing what they don't know and not overwhelming them. It's a fine art, but it's an important balance. And that's again where I think storytelling can be so powerful, because it can be a way of talking about a threat without overwhelming people with the technical details. And also by communicating with something that does unite us all as human beings, and that's emotion. Stories are memorable because they do draw on emotion. And that's why people will then go away. They'll remember stories. And even perhaps most importantly, they will repeat them. They will go back to their teams and say, hey, I was just in this awareness session and I heard about this, this cyber attack that's happening. And I've seen it in the news, but did you know XYZ? Or people might go home to their family and around the dinner table say, I was just reading this book or I was listening to this podcast and I heard about this person who had a phone call and it turned out to be a voice clone. So stories can be really powerful as a way of amplifying and, in a way, simplifying cybersecurity messages.
I love that. Amplifying and simplifying, because you're absolutely correct. Because people will share a story. Sometimes they'll share a statistic. I mean, there are every so often there's a statistic that's just like, oh my gosh, did you hear what the recent number of losses were due to VEC? And maybe someone, but more often people are going to say, I heard this story. And you guys have to hear this story about this kidnapping, and this is something we have to think about and talk about. So I think that's a really critical point. And then simplify also. I think that's also very important. I think a lot of times for people who are particularly from very technical backgrounds, simplification, they don't want to dumb down something. And so there's a concern that they're dumbing something down. They're not giving a full picture of something. But I think that what comes through in your book and just in the way that you approach this entire thing that you do is that simplifying isn't about making something dumb, it's about making something clear. And I think that's an absolutely critical point with communication.
Yeah. And I think in cybersecurity as well, we can be fascinated by the details and fascinated at the details of what makes one attack slightly different to another. So for us, we can sometimes not appreciate the fact that maybe not everybody wants or needs those, completely specific details. So I think we can get caught up on, really technical details that for us are so fascinating. When we're communicating with each other, we love to share that. But it's about understanding our audience and who we're communicating with and what's going to resonate with them, which is why empathy, I think, is so important. It's not about what we want to say, it's about what people will hear and what they will take away.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to get to your writing process, but in a moment. But before we get to that, you said the word takeaway. What are some really core takeaways that you would want someone to take away from your book? And let's say it's someone who's a security awareness leader. What's something you would want them to take away from it?
For the security awareness leaders, I hope that the balance of data and research and stories combined with practical, actionable advice, I hope that's what will really support them in the work that they're doing, and be able to use it maybe to craft some awareness raising messages or to support the awareness raising messages that they're communicating. Because when I'm delivering or creating awareness raising materials, I always want to draw on case studies. I always want to draw on stories, and I want that supported by data, because I know that the different mechanisms of communicating a message will resonate with different people. And so having that blend, I think, is so important, and having a resource that you can turn to where you can say, hey, I'm going to have to communicate to the board next week about AI. And yeah, I could spend however long looking up all the different attacks and trying to find statistics that really work. Well, hopefully they will be able to turn to my book and find some messages, some case studies, some statistics, and key takeaways that would support them in crafting those kind of messages. And I also hope just the way that I've approached the book might inspire some people to think about how they communicate and to think actually being able to use storytelling is really powerful. Quantitative data is great. It's great to have statistics, to have a number of money attached to something, but to know that qualitative data, people's stories, people's experiences are just as valid and can even resonate more.
And are these the same lessons that you would also hope that let's say a CISO or above, a CIO or even a CEO would also take from your book as well? Or is it a slightly different lesson that you hope that they might take from it?
Probably similar, but I think for anybody outside of security, a business leader, for example, I hope that one thing they would take is just how integral cybersecurity is now. Any industry, any part of life, really, whether work or at home, cybersecurity is so important. And that's something that I always try to communicate, whether it's in sessions or in my books, that actually there isn't really a part of our life that isn't touched by cybersecurity. And so, whatever industry we're in, whether we're talking with people working, in business, or whether it's people, in our neighborhood, in our communities, in our families, actually, cybersecurity is relevant to us all and is something we can all feel confident with. It doesn't have to be something scary.
Very well said. Well, fantastic. Unless there's something that you did want to tell our audience on the way out here, I think that you've covered a lot of ground here. And I really appreciate you coming here on this show and talking to me and talking to us.
Oh, I appreciate it so much. I appreciate the space to be able to talk about Hacked. And I sometimes, I often receive messages from people who have read one of my books, and that means so much to me. So if anybody is listening to this, watching this, and they have sent me one of those messages, I just want to say thank you so much. It means more than you probably realize when you let people know that something that they have worked on has helped you or been of interest to you. So I appreciate everybody who does that.
Yeah, I encourage everybody to read the book. I encourage everyone to write a review of the books also. And would it be okay if people connected with you by LinkedIn, Dr.
Would
Barkley?
love that. Yeah,
Okay.
would love that.
And we encourage that as well. Okay. Well, thank you so much for joining. It's been great talking to you as always.
A pleasure to be here. Thank you. And thanks to Hoxhunt and everybody who's joined us.
Okay. You bet. Take care. Stay safe, everybody.